Y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the one, the only, the original Evil Dead. Most of you turkeys know by now that I have been waiting 9 years for this night. I wrote letters, I screamed at the jerkolas who had the rights to this movie. I tried to get it for the first annual World Drive-In Movie Festival and Custom Car Rally back in 1982. I called up all the meatpacking plants in Fort Worth thinking they might want to sponsor a screening during Red Meat Week on the Movie Channel. And I fought with the Movie Channel high sheriffs for 4 solid years, and all they ever told me was it's too grisly for cable. Nobody has any respect for the arts in this country anymore. So you're thinking, well, hey, what's the big deal? Just another zombie splatter movie, right? Well, no, there's one difference. There's only one way to kill the zombies. We're talking total dismemberment. Hands, arms, legs, and of course, heads will roll. You thought those were zombies in Night of the Living Dead? Excuse me while I go buy you a copy of Richard Simmons Sings the Frank Stallone Songbook, Wimp City. You think those were zombies in Dawn of the Dead? Wait here just a minute while I go check the showtimes of Flashdance for you. You might want to look around for some leg warmers to wear on your ankles and a t-shirt with Snoopy on the front. Now that Grandma has left the room, let's take a look at the old Evil Dead barf meter. This is the Paint the Room Red Vomit Champion of the 1980s, and as you can see, it's off the scale. You might want to go get a few...
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, a place you should look up on the map. And it's a warm, very warm day here, but it isn't summer anymore. Well, it is, but it's tapering off. I can feel it. I'm hoping for it. But it's not autumn by any sort of standards I'm used to from back in Alaska, where by now it would be full-on autumn. But I thought what we would do is discuss horror genres and subgenres, including some you may not have heard about before, or if you have heard of them, they're kind of like off in the corners. But what I thought was interesting, now back here I have my part of my library. The rest of it is in Alaska. This is a small part, goes from the ceiling to the wall. 3 meters, is it 3? Oh, sorry, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3 meters. Over 10 feet of videos, Blu-rays and DVDs. I'm not prejudiced, although I don't have any VHS here. I have a few that I will be saving from my Alaskan collection, but over the years I've slowly been plugging in the gaps there. But I thought what I would do is explain, that's a lot of videos, and if you multiply that by about, should we say 9, 10? No, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I would say multiply that by at least 6 or 7. You have the rest of my collection. Now, one of the things I have a lot of is horror. I am particularly fascinated by what horror means to us. And what's interesting is we talk about how the last, 10, 15 years have been, it's all been about superheroes and such. The truth is, the genre that always does well, or at least has been doing well since the beginning of the 21st century, is horror. And we're not going to go into the history of it, although sometime I will do more of a dive into horror history. But what fascinates me is, so I get a video. My friend James Wallace recommended this to me. This is Let's Scare Jessica to Death from 1971. Fascinating film. And I can't put it anywhere until I know what it is. So I have to watch it. So I watched it. And then it left me with some questions. What kind of a film is it? And I think that's a fascinating question, how we file away our films. Now, this gets on to another discussion, which is really complicated. What is horror? And there are always people who say, that's not horror. And I find that that's not horror thing is a very recent thing. People only started saying that's not horror maybe in the late 90s, but it took the internet to get people to go like, that's not horror. So they'll say things like Silence of the Lambs, that's not horror. James is one of those guys. And we're going to have a discussion of, that's not horror versus me, who's much more inclusive. What is my definition for horror? Pretty much anything that would fit in this massive overlook encyclopedia of horror, which is out of print now, but you can still find used copies, which includes a lot of things that one might just call fantastic or just dreadful and horrifying, but not in this more narrower sense of horror. Well, just to let you know, I take the broader view. So, I take a film like Picnic at Hanging Rock, which I think very few people are going to see it for what it is, as a horror film. These days, someone might file it under folk horror, but I'm not so satisfied that's where it belongs, but maybe it does. But anyway, I don't have to worry about it because I have another section for great directors. So I can just file it under Peter Weir, it can sit near all his other films and be happy, and I don't have to make the agonizing decision that I'm going to have to make about this film. So, before I can file something on my wall, even here, I've spent enough time, I've been here for almost 6 years now, even to file something here, I've got to know what it is. Now, the horror section is about from here to here, whereas the rest of it would fit the whole section. But even still, there's enough diversity of horror films now that I have to organize them. There are those people who just do everything alphabetically. If you want to be that chaotic with your life, go ahead. It means your world is just simply A, B, C, which is no order at all. It's convenient. I won't go into all of that. But let's discuss some of the categories that I use. Now, what I've noticed over time is some of the categories that I use for filing horror away are very different from categories people will say, oh, this is a genre, and that's a genre. What's a genre? Films or books or anything that begins to be like other things of its style. So, you have Sherlock Holmes as a detective. And then you get, then there's Father Brown Mysteries. They're detective mysteries. Then there's, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler. They have kind of detective stories. And you see what I'm saying. But at a certain part, you're going to sit there and go like, well, wait a minute. There's a difference between these British ones and these American ones. So we'll call the British ones, British. And then there's a whole thing just for Sherlock Holmes, because it's a massive subject. And another one for hard-boiled detective, which kind of corresponds but not directly into film noir, which we're not going to discuss as a category. But my categories are different. Why? We'll discuss that as we go. But first, I'm going to go through my categories of horror films. I think part of this has to do with the fact we have a generation of people now who don't have as much stuff on the walls. They have it in their computers, or they have it on their letterboxed playlist, or they have it just as a list of something. So that means they don't have to make the agonizing choice I have to make of saying, where does it go? So, the way my categorization starts is it starts with the human and goes down to the supernatural or the spiritual, but not in any direct sense, but you'll feel the progression. Category number 1, and this is one I never hear people talk about, but it's deformity horror. Deformity horror used to be, everyone knew what that was. Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, which many people don't even consider a horror film anymore. Although I had little Aurora models of it, and it was sold to me as a horror film when I was young. Freaks is a deformity film about sideshow freaks. And Eyes Without a Face, French horror film, Les Yeux Sans Visage, is a great horror film, one of my all-time favorites, in my top 10, not of horror films, but of all films. Eyes Without a Face. But Eyes Without a Face is kind of pushing at another genre, although I'd still say it's a deformity horror. And that next genre is body horror. Now, body horror is a new genre. People started talking about this, 10, 15 years ago. Maybe someone used it to describe the work of David Cronenberg, whom I don't put in the horror section or the sci-fi section, because he's a great director and has a diversity of films. If a great director, for me, has only one style they work in, or pretty much one, they'll stay in that style. But if a great director gets out of their lane and starts adding others, so Woody Allen, for me, I have a lot of Woody Allen films. Do I have them all? I think so. He goes not under comedy, but under directors. And it's the same with David Cronenberg. They've escaped the genre jail. But anyway, body horror. Many of the new French extremities, well, wait a minute, Byrne, isn't that another genre? Fit into this. We'll get to that subject in a minute. We also have films like In My Skin, which is indeed a French body horror film about a woman who starts getting, shall we say, too hungrily interested in her skin. And there are plenty more. Body horror seems to involve more of what happens when you bring the insides of the body to the outsides. We'll put it that way. Martyrs could, under some categories, be considered a body horror film. But I'm saving it for another category, which is also something I use that a lot of other people don't seem to use. Next, psycho killers. Now, psycho killers in this definition are basically anything where you have someone going around, or even a family going around and killing people, with some exceptions, which we'll come to in the next category. So, obviously, Psycho is an important psycho killer. If we go back to the Fritz Lang M film from 1931, probably the first true psycho killer film. But then you have slashers. But then I've got a problem. As soon as some people want to put things under slashers, which is fine. You can do whatever you want. And the films like Halloween or Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street are all sold as slasher films. But are they slasher? Are they psycho killer films? And I think the answer is no. Which seems weird because they often start off that way, except Nightmare on Elm Street. But they're more boogeyman films. But if I'm filing them, I would put them as an adjunct to the psycho killer films. But you have Silence of the Lambs, which, yes, I think it's absolutely a horror film. What about it isn't? Yeah, of course. You can have more than one genre in a film. And do I want to put Silence of the Lambs in my crime section? Or do I want to put it in my horror section? I want to put it in my horror section. Because what's going on is horrifying. And the difference is, I think, one of perspective. There are police films, as the French call them, policiers, where you follow the police doing their duty and they're going after a psycho killer. Well, if the emphasis of the film is on the police more than the killer, that's a crime film. And sometimes the distinctions here get narrow, and it's just up to the person, the librarian, to file things in a certain way. We also have Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which I've actually heard a few people say isn't a horror film, which is like, what? Did you watch it and not get, feel the dread just leaking out from every pore because it was actually banned? They gave it an NC-17 rating simply because it was so horrifying. But because, see, a lot of these people think it has to follow the slasher tropes, which I think is a ridiculous idea. And then just recently, and this is a film, I just saw it in the theaters, I thought it might be the best horror film of 2024, Longlegs. Well, is that a psycho killer film? Yes, but maybe it's something else, which we'll come to. Now here's a category I've never heard anyone mention, and it's a massive category, just sitting, squatting, right next to the psycho killer category. Interestingly enough, the psycho killer category is largely male. Some of the family members occasionally are not, but most of them are. So there's another category, and it's relatively new, chronologically speaking. It's psycho women. Now, psycho women, I purposely put it there as not psycho killer women, because you can have all sorts of things. I was thinking that the first one was Roman Polanski's Repulsion, which comes a couple years after Psycho. But in fact, what's this? What's this? What's this? What's this? Oh, this film from the 1930s, 13 Women. This is actually a psycho killer film. And at first you think it's a man, but it ends up being a woman. And actually, there's quite a few of those where just categorizing the film ends up by giving away the plot. Which I think it's one of the rare film genres where just knowing that where the film should be put into, what subject it goes with, ruins the film for you. But I got to be honest and say, no, those are women killing, not men. Now, here's the thing. It's not just psycho killer ladies. It's also women who just go absolutely bonkers in very weird ways. So there's a film called Kissed, came out of Canada, directed by a woman, Lynn Stopovich, or something like that. Stopovich. Soon. We'll get to the witches. But it's about a woman who, as a young girl, has a kind of a thing about death. She ends up working as a mortician and gets really, really spiritually connected to dead bodies in a, shall we say, very unwholesome way. And yet somehow, at the end of that film, it comes out like she's a New Ager and that she's just sending them off. It's just a very bizarre film. Total psycho woman film. And there are others where the woman isn't necessarily a killer. Although, then you get to something like, The Girl Next Door. That's one of the most intense psycho women films there are. And we're not talking about the one with, that was just kind of a comedy with a little porny edge on it. We're talking about the ones, Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door. That one's, I don't recommend that one. And here's one where I spoil it by telling you all the girls love Mandy Lane. Goes in the psycho women film because it seems like a psycho killer film. But then again, are we really surprised it was one of Amber Heard's first movies? We won't go there. Now here's the one, another one, squatting right next door, also recent. So for instance, the psycho women category has only started developing, really, I think it took feminism for it to develop, second wave feminism. And even then, not until much more recently in the 90s, you start to get a whiff of it. And in the 21st century, I mean, it's a huge category for me back with my big library. Because it's like, oh man, we just keep churning these things out. And no one ever talks about it as a separate category. Could it be politically incorrect to call it a category? I don't think so. Let's be honest. The next one is really interesting. I call it, because I don't have another name for it, but cabal horror. What do I mean by cabal horror? It's different than, say, something like cult horror, and cult horror is really hard to define. But cabal horror has certain elements. One, it's a group of people controlling what is going on with a group, with other people, often ending in death or something horrifying. And it's not supernatural. Although the people may be doing some sort of cultish activity, but it is still not a supernatural film. In other words, it's not like The Believers or The Serpent and the Rainbow, which are both films about more actual supernatural cults. So, in this, the OG is Salo, which is about a group of Nazis in the Italian Alps who have captured a group of youngsters, shall we say, and are doing some rather devious things. Do not watch this film if you are at all squeamish. It is, I think, a work of art, but it is, as is said in the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre, describing the desiccated graves at the beginning, a grisly work of art. Although this one's kind of seductive. It starts off, you see these young people, and then, anyway, we won't go into it. Martyrs fits here. Because the point of Martyrs is not the body horror, although they certainly do indulge in it, but it's the cabal behind it orchestrating everything. You have Kill List, which is a fascinating film. Starts off like an assassination film, which would fit in crime, until you get to the last third of it, and suddenly it's like you realize all this stuff has been orchestrated, and it's nightmarish. And there's another movie called The Conspiracy, which was a found footage film. Where are found footage films, Bern? We're coming to that. And then, let's see, Midsommar might be considered a cabal film because the main guy who invites the dumb Americans to Europe, when Americans go to Europe, we're always dumb, and there's a reason for that. We are. Just look at any of the videos where people ask, what do you think's going on in France or Europe or anything? And Americans come across like a box of cornflakes, just absolutely clueless. It's rare that you'll get people who actually know answers to questions about what's going on in Europe, particularly related to history. Anyway, but Midsommar we're going to save for another category a little bit later, and I'll tell you why when we get there. Then we have psychic and mental horror. And I've kind of smushed these together. Psychic horror would be someone who has psychic gifts, like The Gift with Cate Blanchett, which kind of comes across like a crime film. I got all these dramatic elements. But in fact, it's all about her psychic abilities. But here's one that's more of a mental film. Mental films would be films that all occur within someone's head or have to do with mental properties. Jacob's Ladder, not to spoil it, but it's a mental film. I'm not going to say any more about it. If you haven't seen it, you should. Then we come to, so now we're crossing a line here, but before we go into the full-on spiritual, supernatural stuff, let's go to man-made monsters. So now, over in science fiction, I've got some more horrifying stuff. I'll mention that in a bit. But man-made monsters start with the OG, Frankenstein. And it is essentially this is where you get the mad scientist trope as well. So you get the Invisible Man. You get Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These kinds of films where someone does something to tinker with something and turns it into something else. Now, sometimes this tinkering actually creates something not from the living flesh of a human, but from other properties. And these would be puppet and doll horror films. So we have Dead of Night is like the first one from about 1946, British anthology film, where one of the sections in it has a puppet who is among the most evil ventriloquist puppet. Why are ventriloquist puppets always so evil? And there are more ventriloquist puppets. But more recently we had Megan, which one could argue is an AI android, but it's a doll. So I put it here more than, say, over with next to Her in the science fiction section. We've got Stop Motion just came out about a woman continuing on with the stop motion project, and a lot of evil, weird dolls, puppets in there. And then, more controversially, what is Longlegs really about? And what's with all the dolls going on in that, and mannequins? So, those are puppet and doll movies. And there are quite a few more. And there is, in fact, a whole raft of films which wouldn't be included in here that are actual puppet and doll films. These are puppet and doll horror films that focus more on the subject, but have enough live action going on that it's not an animation film, although there may be animation in it. Then we have zombies, which in some cases are human-made. The earliest zombies, and this is where we're now at this borderland between the spiritual and the physical. The earliest zombie films, like White Zombie, I Walked with a Zombie, I Walked with a Zombie is such a great film, are about people putting curses on people. Hear that word, we're going to come back to it, curses. Putting curses on people and turning them into the Walking Dead. Later, through a mutation that involved a lot of EC comics in the middle and then artists like Bernie Wrightson, you started having the zombies getting out of the grave as these decayed corpses and then becoming, George Romero turns them into the zombies, the walking, shuffling zombies of Night of the Living Dead, which are also kind of explained a bit by spiritual forces. But there are other zombie films where the zombies are made, and then right next to this, are films that are infection films, or I think it was it Leo Fulci or one of the great Italian can you call an Italian horror film director great? Particularly the ones who direct the cannibal films, which we'll discuss them too. Called them infected people films. I think it was Leo Fulci, but you have films where the infection isn't necessarily the same as The Walking Dead or that sort of thing, but rather it was something like a disease that spread. And 28 days later, it's a rage virus. You have Contagion, which I think should go here too. Interestingly enough, the remake of Rec is Quarantine, and that's an infection film. Whereas Rec, the Spanish original, is not. But we'll discuss that in just a moment. Now we come to one of my all-time favorite genres. This is the one where we cross over into the supernatural and the spiritual. And that is haunted house films. Now, I did a study once with a friend of mine, Karsten. He came up for the summer in Alaska, and we watched approximately, 70 haunted house films, which ranged from The Old Dark House, which is one of the earliest ones. Interestingly enough, the earliest haunted house films are already satirical and comic. And the reason is because people have read so many haunted house stories since the earliest Gothic and Romantic horror stories that they were all familiar. Everyone was familiar with the haunted house tropes. But we went from there all the way through all of the classic haunted house films to Tarkovsky's Stalker, which is kind of a haunted house film too. So, although I do not keep, Stalker does not hang out with haunted house films, it hangs out with Tarkovsky. So, but then we have, so we had The House on Haunted Hill. The Old Dark House was an early one, House on Haunted Hill from the 1950s, along with 13 Ghosts, both of which were remade in the late 90s, interestingly enough. Although they were given the lavish, we've got too much money to spend, and we want to add digital effects treatment. I think the originals are in some way more interesting because they're lo-fi, they're more psychological in a way. But also, Incident in a Ghostland is a very interesting recent film. It's also just called Ghostland. By Pascal Laugier. I really recommend that film. But it's also very disturbing haunted house film. And there are haunted house films that don't feature ghosts at all, but rather feature strange people stuck in the walls of the houses and things like that. And I consider those to be haunted house films as well in their own ways, because the subject of the haunted house film is the house. And one thing you'll notice here is what I have done in all of my categories is what I'm valuing is the subject more than the mood. Then there are other hauntings and ghosts, including Insidious, which the ghost or demon seems to follow a child around. Then you have, let's see what else. The Ring. Is that a haunted tape? Or is it something else? Should I have a section for technological kinds of horror, including various things, the kinds of films that you find in, the computer films and such like that. Well, that gets into a whole other category. For instance, I put Unfriended, particularly the second one, in the cabal territory, since it's all being controlled by someone else, which I think makes a lot of sense. Okay, what else? Oh yeah, The Innocents is a very interesting haunting film. Because who's doing the haunting? Well, the haunting is being done by two people, but it's for the woman more than the house, although it's a haunted house film. Then we have curse films. Sometimes the houses are cursed, sometimes the people are cursed, but the curse film is interesting for having no other elements but the curse. So there's a 1950s film called The Maze, which is a fantastic film, could be considered a haunted house film, but the whole point is what's going on in the maze outside the garden, outside in the backyard. The Ring, I think, could be considered a curse film as well. There was an odd little film called Population 436, which I think is a perfect example of a curse film, because for some reason, we don't know why, the population in this town always has to stay at 436 people. So when someone dies, someone new has to come into the community, and when someone dies in the community, it's just a fascinating thing. There is nothing else going on, but it's a horror story nonetheless. Ringu is definitely a curse film, and I would say that more than anything, because it's a tape that's cursed, or haunted, or possessed. You see, the dividing line gets a little thing, but we'll call it a curse. But who put the curse on it? That's another question. Then we come to vampire films, which obviously we all know what those are. You have Dracula, Nosferatu. I really like Near Dark, which is kind of an American Gothic vampire film from the 1980s, one of my favorites. Blade, more than a superhero film, I think it's a vampire film, the series. Then you got Twilight. Yes, I put Twilight in with all my vampire horror films. Why? It's part of the genre. Where else would it go? Romance? No. People do have odd categories these days, like action horror. I have no idea what that means. If it's an action horror and if it's very exciting like Blade, but it includes vampires and the vampires are central, it's a vampire film. It's so simple. And how would you, what kind of category? But I noticed that they started selling films as action films when they were actually science fiction films back in the 90s. Prior to that, Terminator was seen more as a science fiction film. But by Terminator 2, they started calling it an action film. Well, what is an action film? Does it just have a lot of explosions? Is that what makes an action film? What are they exploding? We won't go into it all. And Abigail is a very recent film, which I hate to mention that it's a vampire film because it really spoils the plot in a way. I wish they had found a way to market it without revealing that detail, but I'm going to spoil it too. So there you are. Werewolves. The Wolfman is the oldest werewolf film. Curse of the Werewolf. Curse. But it's a werewolf film. American Werewolf in London. Ginger Snaps is a great horror series of 3, particularly the first one, from the early aughts. And it features female vampires Very interesting. And then finally, with this creature category, we have were creatures, other were creatures. So there's a movie called The Last Winter of these guys set in an Arctic research facility, and they're all being taken out by this elk kind of creature. The ritual also has a very strange deer, elk-related being in it as well. Then we have mermaid films, which I think are really interesting, but we'll mention those more in a moment. And then there is, for instance, this is where we start getting next to folk horror. In the area I lived in for 22 years in Alaska, Haines, Alaska, in the Chilkat Valley, they have a legend of this otter shapeshifter called the Kushtaka. And the Kushtaka is basically a were-otter. Part human, part otter, part demon. We need to see a movie about that. Think about it. We haven't seen it yet. Now we've arrived at the subject of folk horror. Now, I wasn't sure I wanted to create a folk horror category. It's a rather new category, and it's the kind of category with really blurry borders. So I'm putting it as there has to be a group that someone enters in from the outside. This group is not simply witches, or else they go in the next category, which indeed is witches. But rather it has to be old pagan revivals, that sort of thing. So this is where Midsommar goes. This is where the original, and even the remake of The Wicker Man goes. You know, there are many others. I have a 3-hour documentary on folk horror. And it's amazing to me how blurry the borders get with this stuff. They just want to assume everything. Which means it's a category that's going to be, it would just grow and grow and grow. And you could use it as more of a stylistic category than a subject. But I'm using it as a subject category, so it's much smaller. Which brings us to witches. Interestingly enough, most of the earliest witch films in America were kind of funny, like was it Bell Book and Candle and I Married a Witch? They were like witch comedies, and these are from the 40s and 50s. Why? Because no one took witchcraft seriously at all. There was Haksan from Denmark, made in the silent era, but even that was not taking witchcraft seriously. It was basically saying witchcraft was all, was it a delusion? Maybe. But nevertheless, you didn't have supernatural witches. But then you get to stuff like Suspiria in the 1970s. There had been a revival of magic and witchcraft in the late 60s, along with the counterculture. Then you have The Craft, more recent Blair Witch Project, very much a witch film, and of course more recently The Witch. Or why do some people say The Vitch? Do they not know that the double V's would have been an ancient printing technique, which just means W because they didn't want, the ancient printers couldn't handle a W? Don't know. I saw it listed somewhere online and kind of like, you idiots, it's witch. It's not the vitch. Anyway, that kind of stuff drives me nuts. Then we come to something that's definitely a subject category, although it's kind of a mood as well, and that is Lovecraftian horror. Basically, this is any horror featuring things like tentacled beings, featuring things like cosmic horror coming from outside the universe, bringing this message of extreme doom and fatalism and nihilism along with them. That the old gods are coming, but the old gods don't care about you at all. You're just debris in the way. The Dunwich Horror was one of the first ones of these from the 1960s, but didn't get too much into the most Lovecraftian aspects. Color from Outer Space, a recent Nick Cage movie, very good at getting the Lovecraftian vibe. I really like Dagon from the year 2000. And one could say Alien is a Lovecraftian film. It's been pointed out many times, but I'm saving it for another category. And then there are demon films, demons. So you have The Evil Dead, filled with demons. You have Smile, more recently, is about demons. And you have When Evil Lurks and Paranormal Activity. These are all demon films. What's the difference between a demon film and the next category, possession films? Sometimes not much, but you can be possessed by more than demons. So in Rec, you have demons. It is a found footage film. You have in Hereditary. What is going on in that film? It's really tough. It's essentially almost a bloodline thing that you're possessed by, demonic bloodlines. The Shining. What are you possessed by in The Shining? Are you possessed by the house, ghosts? Maybe you're not possessed at all. And people debate that film because it famously doesn't go along with Stephen King's novel, which has much more of a direct statement of what's going on. Then you get to, how do we get rid of the demons? Exorcism. So there are quite a few exorcism films, with the OG being The Exorcist, and many people thinking that's the best. And you have The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which came out in 2005. Absolutely amazing acting by Jennifer Carpenter, and a great mix of genres with horror and courtroom drama. Very fascinating. Then you have The Last Exorcist, which was a found footage film, but phenomenal acting by Ashley Bell, who I haven't seen enough of. She did a couple of films that I really liked and then kind of just passed out of visibility. This happens, sadly. Then we come to apocalyptic films. Now, this is not post-apocalyptic. This is not the science fiction genres. This is when there is much more of a religious interpretation to the apocalypse. So you have things like The Omen. Omen's not a science fiction film. The Omen is an apocalyptic horror film. Along with this year's The First Omen, which is not the first Omen, but The Omen was the first Omen. We won't go into all that. And Knowing came out a couple of years ago, and that was a very interesting film with Nick Cage again. Nick Cage is like the MVP of weird films. I recommend watching it. Again, apocalyptic. I won't spoil it for you. And then finally we come to Death and Hell. And people die, and then depending on where they go. There are only a couple of films about heaven, and I put them in here too, like What Dreams May Lie. What was that? Anyway, there was that film. There's another film about people after death. But generally, a lot of these films deal with hell. So going back to 1911 in Italy, you have The Inferno, which is a fantastic film filled with real-world practical special effects, which I highly recommend for those of you who have the patience and have not been attention deficit disordered. But also we have The Beyond, also known as The Seven Doors to Hell, about a place with its entrance right over hell. And more recently, As Above, So Below, which I think is a fantastic film. And it is a found footage film set in the weirder parts of the Paris catacombs. That's all I will mention about it. Now, there are some horror film genres which you might have expected to hear here but didn't hear. Again, these are all subjects. I found everything by subject, not by mood or style. We'll come to that in just a moment. But one of them is sci-fi horror. So, Alien is going to go up in sci-fi with the aliens. And there are also going to be some things in other categories in science fiction. Creature features would go up there. So Godzilla, King Kong, that's all up in science fiction. Let's see, what else? Mermaids and sirens. I have those in a special category in the fantasy zone. Because I think a mermaid and a siren, you can have a funny one like Splash, or you can have some really, truly dark things. So I think mermaid and siren films are a very interesting category, often featuring very dark horror. And then there's something I call adventure horror. Now, just a couple of minutes ago I said, ooh, I hate the idea of action horror. Because action doesn't mean anything. But adventure, I think, is much more narrowly defined. And it's defined as us up against the elements. And it's the jungles, the seas, the deserts, the Arctic, the mountains, things like that. So that obviously includes a lot of adventure, includes a lot of things that aren't horror films. However, it also includes some things which definitely are. Jaws is an adventure horror film. And it's certainly an adventure, and it's certainly a horror film, and it's us against the ocean and the creature of the ocean. Cannibal films from Italy, those Italian ones, and the more recent one by Eli Roth, The Green Inferno. These are also jungle adventure films. And Cannibal Holocaust is exactly a jungle adventure film. But my goodness, how dark the jungle gets. And I think that's interesting because the jungle is such an interesting symbol to us. We tend to call them the rainforest now as a way to get away from the terror of the jungle. And it can be read either way, as a very pleasant place of life or as a dark, foreboding place. I think part of it depends on what you bring into it, how much knowledge. So some of the categories I've just listed here are not categories you hear most of the time when other people discuss horror genres and subgenres. What's the difference between a horror genre and a subgenre? Well, vampires is definitely a horror genre. And under vampires, there are all sorts. For instance, there's a big difference between the evil-looking Nosferatu vampire and the suave Dracula vampire. Right there you have a big split. But then you get to things like Near Dark, which is an American Gothic vampire drama. So we have categories here which I've listed, which a lot of people don't. Adventure horror, cabal horror, psycho women, curse films, deformity horror, American Gothic horror, which I've mentioned, but I think it's more in the next category, and mermaid and siren horror. Now, I think those are all very valid horror categories. And why don't other people mention them? I think it's because they're involved in a whole different system of categorization than I am. Let's discuss it. Now, one thing you'll notice I don't do is I don't file things under J-horror, Japanese horror, or K-horror, Korean horror, or found footage, or religious horror, whatever that is. I've discovered that, and listening, and this is with younger people who don't have so much, their roots aren't as deep into the history of the horror genre. Many of them seem to start in maybe the 80s, a little bit of the 70s, the 80s, and then they really kick in the 21st century, and they think we've arrived at the greatest moment. This is one of the golden ages, or has been. I don't know if it still is, but there's certainly a lot of great horror films that have come out in the 21st century. But we're going to call these style genres. So I can imagine a person who has a wall full of these things, who puts them all their horror films by style. So one could have, for instance, a section for silent horror. One could have German expressionism. If these names don't mean anything to you, that's okay. You just get the idea that there are styles. I'm not going to go into explaining them all. You could have Universal monsters from the Universal Pictures. You could have Hammer horror. You could have 70s and early 80s grindhouse kind of stuff. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Cannibal Holocaust are all grindhouse fare from the 70s and early 80s. You could have, this is a category mostly for the Brits, video nasties. This is not a category Americans ever use, but the Brits talk about it like it's universal, but we never had people censoring all of our videotapes the way they did in the UK. Then you have these, let's see what else, direct-to-video or direct-to-VHS or direct-to-DVD videos, but a lot of this starts coming out in the 1980s into the 90s. And so you have companies like the Trauma Films or anything Charles Band was created. But some of the great films in this category would be the stuff made by Stuart Gordon, which almost so much of it came out direct-to-video. Brian Usna as well, very interesting director. Then you have found footage. Now, for many people, found footage is everything is like it either is found footage or it's not. And people have this real amazing fixation on it. I would take any found footage film and say, well, what's this really about? Okay, Paranormal Activity, demons. Blair Witch Project, witches. As above, so below, hell. So I would use that. But they would call it a style. J-horror, Japanese horror. K-horror, Korean horror. Now what's weird is if you look at J-horror, the oldest ones are things like Anibaba, which is a kind of a demon film. But then you have Hausu, which is unclassifiable, but kind of a haunted house film. Then you have Ringu, and then Ju-on. And those are all J-horror. K-horror, listen to this, K-horror, and these are all within the last 10, 15 years. You have The Wailing, Train to Busan, and The Host. You can't find three more different things, but nevertheless, they're all from Korea. So many people consider the place of origin to be more important than what the film is actually about. And this is in this kind of way of looking at things through styles. New French Extremity. American Gothic. Now what's interesting is I hear people use the word Western horror, but that's an American Gothic. Anything that takes place in the corrupt, any decayed part of America, or South America, or Canada, or anything else. We have standard Gothic, which is vampires and werewolves and all this. But American Gothic is very different and uses very different tropes. And if you see any horror film that mixes the West with horror elements, that is an American Gothic film, more than anything else. So, American Gothic films could be Ravenous, but it could also be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. If I was going to do things by style, I would put those together. Also, the work of Stephen King. So much of it is American Gothic, one way or another. It's Maine Gothic, New England Gothic. But you could have a New York City Gothic. The gritty. Is Joker a horror film? I think it kind of is. And it's New York City Gothic as well. Religious. I hear this being used more and more. People are saying we don't want any more religious films this year. For films like Immaculate or The First Exorcist, or The Pope's Exorcist, or The First Omen, rather, The Pope's Exorcist, all this stuff. And I'm sitting there going like, hey, you guys, we already had categories for those. And one thing you'll notice they all have in common is Catholicism. So we could call them Catholic horror films, but religious is just way too broad. And in fact, any demon film, any witch film, anything that involves anything supernatural is pretty much a religious horror film, one way or another, depending on how you look at it. So, and then folk category, folk horror has been simply consuming lots of other stuff. I mentioned witches, but it also consumes curse films, and it consumes everything it gets next to, which for me is just way too vague. If I had all these films under folk horror, I would have to take a bunch out and recategorize them anyway, because they're all so different from each other. And then you have giallo, which is the Italian word for yellow, based on the cover of certain books that the Italians sold, paperbacks that were cheap, horror related, but also crime related. And giallo films are interesting because they can be either supernatural or not. They can just be crime films with lots of stylization. So are all giallo films the same? No. Although I feel like they should be together, but I don't feel the same way about K-horror or New French Extremity. So I have to watch myself that I don't just use countries to... I do use countries to file all of my music, which I find a better way than just, say, heavy metal, punk, folk or whatever. And then finally we come to anthologies, which I do consider a legitimate category. I put it at the beginning of my horror section. Now, let's go back to this film. Let's Scare Jessica to Death. 1971. Retrospectively, it acts like a folk horror film. But nobody thought of it as a folk horror film at the time. But it's similar to Harvest Home and other films like that. But the problem is, are the people who are coming back to life, are they ghosts after they're dead? And is it a community of ghosts? Or are they vampires? I'm opting out for vampires because people get bitten on the neck and turn into something. So, Let's Scare Jessica to Death goes with the other vampire movies. So there you are. Because I do it by subject, not mood. If I was doing it by mood, I might choose folk horror. Now, there is one place I really get stumped and really have to think about, and that has to do with comedies. So, with comedies, when is a film more of a comedy than a horror film? And when is a film more of a horror film than a comedy? So Beetlejuice, which has horrific elements, is to me purely a comedy. And one would put it right next to The Addams Family, which is where I do put films like that. There's kind of a little section for comedy horror, or is it horror comedy? Whatever. You get the idea. There are films which are obviously comedies first, with the horror element second. But then, where do I put Shaun of the Dead or Evil Dead 2? To me, part of it is, I think, if I was walking in off the street with no knowledge of this film, and I didn't watch horror films, and wasn't particularly aware of different categories, what would I say this is a horror film? And I think the answer is yes, because in both Evil Dead 2 and Shaun of the Dead, the horror and violence is taken extremely graphically and seriously. Now, there may be things now which that's not true, because we've come to a point where for instance, I just watched, what was it? Deadpool and Wolverine. And I said to myself, this is a slapstick comedy. There's the scene where Deadpool and Wolverine are killing all the other Deadpools. And it was just so funny. And I said, really? This is in the inheritance of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and Lloyd. It's like this film, I said, they are doing slapstick comedy here with tons and tons of gore and blood. So I could see a more recent film being more of a straight comedy because it depends on the era it comes out in. But nevertheless, I think of Shaun of the Dead as being more horror than comedy. So to me, it goes in the section with all the other Walking Dead films and zombie films and George Romero and all that stuff. I think it's in that. And I think that's where it should be. Those are its friends. Now, there's another category I didn't mention, and that is animation. Where does something like Vampire Hunter D go? Well, animation to me is a very separate kind of an art form. So I don't put, for instance, I have lots of puppet films which have horrific elements. I don't even think about putting them anywhere but with puppet films and stop motion and that sort of stuff. But then same with animation and all of that. So that is just my overview of horror genres and subgenres. You don't have to agree at all. You can file yours all by DVD cover. What color they are. But, the truth is, most of the people who would think like that don't have DVD or Blu-ray collections. I think if you've gotten the limit of keeping your physical media, which I highly recommend, given the way the world is going, I would say this. Organize them. Be a librarian. Think about it. I suppose you could use the Dewey Decimal System, but that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Anyway, from Tbilisi, Georgia, someplace you've probably never been to, this is Burns saying thanks for joining us here on the Anadrome, and we will meet again. Droibit. Oh, and if you want to support the channel, subscribe. Put some money in the coffer. I make no money off of these things because I'm in Georgia. So, just saying. Droibit.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.
I have seen the dark shadows moving in the woods, and I have no doubt that Whatever I have resurrected is sure to come calling for me.
It was the woods themselves. They're alive.
Evil Dead. They got up on the wrong side of the grave. Evil Dead from New Line Cinema.
And that's it. I'm exhilarated from the world cable premiere of the uncut Evil Dead. What's left to say about it? I mean, it's kind of the way you feel the day after the Super Bowl. I mean, why go on living?